Okay, back for the second half. And I'm just going to, I think we'll go through the four speakers one after the other and then have questions and discussion at the end, and I can bring the speakers back in as appropriate rather than having a bit stopping after every speaker. I'm going to start with David Weston, Chief Executive of the Teacher Development Trust, to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Sam. Really delighted to be co-organising this with Teach First as well. So I've only got 5 minutes, so I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the research about what effective leaders do to raise attainment in schools and actually how that fits in with observation. Because I think the interesting thing when you look at Vivian Robinson's research from 2009 on what effective leaders do to raise attainment in their schools, then there are actually two things involving observation. The first one is instructional support, and that's the very top-down approach, which is judging lessons and giving feedback and giving sort of lesson guidelines, and this is a standard approach that we use across this school, maybe giving lectures to staff and getting everybody standardized. And Robinson showed that that form of leadership activity does raise attainment, and she put on it an effect size of 0.42, which is quite high. However, compare and contrast to another leadership dimension she looked at, which was expanding the capacity of teachers to improve themselves. And that's a very bottom-up approach, and that includes things like teachers peer observing each other, critiquing each other, co-observing learning issues, using an inquiry approach where they're digging into the problem and understanding what's causing the learning issues and then building on those. It's very much developing the capacity of teachers to teach what students need to learn, but doing it themselves. Now, that bottom-up approach was twice as effective. What is actually, I have to say, it's a big claim, effect size of 0.84, exactly double that of instructional. Now, I think in most schools we'd see probably 80% instructional leadership, if possibly more than that, and then a very small amount of this bottom-up approach. And actually, clearly, school leaders should be flipping that over and saying the instructional leadership is important, but actually it should be much smaller in comparison to the encouraging the professional learning. Now, an inquiry approach, which I think lies at the heart of getting teachers to peer observe and improve each other, is a really powerful one. This is an example from my charity's National Teacher Inquiry Network. And essentially what we're saying to teachers is collaboratively identify a learning issue, think about how you're going to evaluate the impact that your changes are having on learners, get a baseline to understand where you're starting from and, if possible, a group to compare to, and then go through an iterative process of digging into that learning issue, finding the research on what is best, collaborating with each other, discussing, thinking, digging deep into the pedagogy. And after you've iterated that process, eventually you will come to a deeper understanding, and you can show through your evaluation that you have improved the learning of students. Peer observation will be a key part of that. Now, at the heart of that process is lesson study, and I'm really passionate about this model as a co-observational teacher inquiry model, which is right at the heart of the work that we do. And it's very simple, and it's this. Essentially, you ask a triad of teachers to plan a series of activities in a lesson together. And for each of those activities, they then predict how do we think that element of teaching is going to cause certain elements, certain aspects of learning. So they predict the reactions of usually 3 pupils, perhaps a low, medium and high prior attainment pupil as an example. Having made those predictions, which forces them to think, how does pedagogy link to learning, they then observe that lesson, but they are not observing the teacher and saying that's outstanding, good, requires improvement. They're simply saying, did the predictions that we make lead to the learning that we expected? They may talk to the pupils, they may have designed some assessments into that lesson to try and understand more of what's happening, but the really important part is the reflection that happens afterwards, because then they're confronted by, well, from our understanding of learning, this activity should have led to that bit of learning, but actually this student's needs were completely different to this student. Now, what we're finding, as Professor Pete Dudley has found, who's one of the champions of this approach in the UK, is that teachers are really confronted by having to dig right into their understanding of learning. And it really makes them understand each student as an individual. It really makes them understand different needs and understand how different types of teaching lead to different types of learning. So I think it's really powerful. But the point is, this is a very peer observation model. It's not a top-down model where you're making judgments. It's very developmental, but it's challenging. challenging. So I haven't got a long time to talk. If you want to find out a bit more, it's our National Teacher Inquiry Network there, or Professor Pete Dudley's resources, lessonstudy.co.uk. And if you want to get in touch, please do. I think, Sam, are we going to take a few questions after each speaker, or just do all the speakers? Okay, right. In that case, I'll hand over to David Didau.
Thanks, David. I do. Okay, so I haven't got any slides, and so we'll leave. Oh no, he's going to turn them off. So basically, I'm really interested in listening to someone like Robert Coe, who says all these things about what the research tells us about, because it fits so precisely with my own kind of, my own thinking that's evolved over the years. But it's come from a separate route, which is quite interesting. So one of the things which has had a massive influence on my thinking has been the work of an American academic called Robert Burke, who's at UCLA, and he's fascinated by learning and forgetting and memory and things like that. And one of the things, and it really struck me as something quite powerful when I first read about it, was the idea that learning and performance are different. Learning and performance are not the same thing. And if we go and observe a lesson, what we see is performance. And from it, maybe we can infer some things about learning, but maybe not. And I really like Rob's use of the phrase "poor proxies for learning." That's quite sexy, and his list of those things absolutely are the sorts of things which we decide are learning, when in actual fact, I'm sure I'm not the only person here who's had an experience of teaching a lesson which I thought went brilliantly. And I patted myself on the back for doing all the right things. So I've done my exit cards and a little bit of AFL, and we've had our traffic lights. It's all gone spiffingly. And then, next lesson, they can't bloody remember anything I said to them. So what's happening there? I've also taught some lessons which have been horrible. And I've held my head in shame presiding over something so dreadful. And the kids come back next week and they have remembered. And one of the things which is fascinating is that there's extremely poor correlation between performance during classroom activities and long-term retention and transfer of skills and knowledge. They don't correlate well at all. And even more difficult than that is the fact that actually performance gains, short-term performance gains, seem to, in some cases, actually prevent learning. So there's something quite interesting going here. And one of the things which I think is quite pernicious in our climate in the UK is the use in the Ofsted literature of the phrase rapid and sustained progress. And I think you either have one or the other. You're faced with the choice of either looking for rapid progress or sustained progress. You can't do something really quickly and it lasts a long time. It's my contention. You might take issue with that, and I'm very happy to be poo-pooed on that score. But if that's the case, and there's a huge body of research, and I wrote a blog which I've put on the timeline for this, which in advance of this, which links to a huge literature review that Bjork and Sandstrom put out 2013, with linking to about 60, 70 different studies on these kinds of subjects. And if this huge weight of research on things like this is true, I think one of the things that we're faced with is the problem, the cult of the outstanding lesson, actually is retarding learning. It's getting in the way of kids learning. So the more effort we put into the visible, here and now, tricks, gimmicks, whistles, all of that stuff, the more we're devaluing long-term retention and transfer of skills and knowledge, which is quite counterintuitive, and one of the reasons why I also love the gorilla. So I'm sorry you didn't show us the clip, because it's a lovely clip. I often use it in training, and I didn't see the gorilla when I first saw that clip, and I first saw it. A friend of mine had been on one of those courses where you either take the points or go on a driver re-education thing, and their point they were making in that was, we don't see motorcyclists, and a lot of motorcyclists die because we think we'd see them, but we don't see them. And they used that video to make that point in that setting. So So for me, the big problem is if learning and performance are two different things, and that maybe sometimes we can infer learning from performance, but actually often we can't. One of the things that we should the first thing that we should do is to make sure people understand this difference. That what you can see in a lesson, the way students are performing, is going to have very little impact on what they actually learn next week, next month, next year. So, obviously, I completely agree with Rob that the idea of learning is invisible. You can't see it. Certainly can't see it in the here and now of classroom activities. That's Graham Nuttall's phrase, which I really like. Another researcher from a completely independent route confirms this view. And if that's the case, what I think what we need to do is we need to stop the whole of the process of having people come into lessons and downloading in some way their idea about what good looks like onto the person they're observing, whether it's done in a judgmental way, whether it's done in a formative way, because probably you will be wrong. Not maybe. If there's such a poor correlation between performance and learning, and sometimes what looks bad actually has a positive impact, then we do a lot better to not do that. I think one of the most fascinating models is for classroom observation is the one taken by Doug Lemov and the Uncommon Schools Network in America, where what they did was completely driven by data. They wanted to find out what made effective teachers. So they looked at data and they found outliers, people who in tough schools got great results. And then they went to watch them to find out what they did, assuming, maybe correctly, you could take issue with this, that what they did was probably good because they were getting such good results, and then trying to replicate that. So we'll have a look at what they did, and then we'll get other people to do the same thing. That seems to me a much better, if you're going to observe people, observe to find out what's good, then replicate it, rather than going through that process. And I wanted to ask a question when Robert was speaking. I didn't really expect him to be able to answer this. That if there's somebody out there, and I know there are, because I have people, like Rob, I have people contacting me regularly to tell me of their woes, who has been told that they require improvement in some way. Their job is on the line. If Tristram Hunt gets his way, oh my goodness. If the evidence for the research on the efficacy of lesson observation is so poor, have you got a legal case? One of the things I think we need to do as teachers is we need to step up and we need to reclaim our professional expertise. We need to insist in a much better quality conversation, and that's basically it. So thank you very much for inviting me. I do feel like the odd one out, but thanks very much.
Okay, going to hand over now to Mary Myatt.
Thank you then. Am I standing in the right place? Just to make it clear, I'm Mary Myatt. I'm a statistic of one. I don't speak for anyone apart from myself. And that my observations for the next 5 minutes or so come from 20-odd years' experience, of which the last 4 or 5 have been involved in inspections. I'm also very aware of the extent and the limits of my own efficacy and impact, and they reside broadly in 3 areas. The first is my own personal professional practice, which I base on humility, which isn't to say that it's always right, which is why I'm able to say that. In terms of the teams that I work with, both when I'm part of a team, an inspection team, or if I'm leading a team, I make it very clear about what the tone and the principles on which we're conducting a team inspection should be taking place, and finally through my writing. So that's the position I'm coming from. There are 3 points I want to make broadly tonight, and the first is this, that we're sitting in a system of accountability, and £88 billion and rising of public money is going to have some kind of quality assurance sitting around it. Now, we can call that Ofsted as it is at the moment. It is enshrined in law. The 2005 Education Act is where it's sitting. We can call it Ofsted, we can call it Mocksted, we could call it FCUK-sted, whatever we call it. There is going to be some kind of structure which is basically looking at the fundamental question, are our children getting a reasonable or better deal? So in terms of my impact, I don't have the ear of Sir Michael Wilshaw. I'm sure he's very relieved to know that. But I will come back to that, because one of my concerns is that we're not just talking to one another, and I think we're going to need some kind of agency to move this forward. I'll return to that in a moment. Senior moment. The second point I want to make is around the school inspection handbook. It says quite clearly that inspectors have got to gather evidence on the quality of teaching and learning. That's what we have to do. And one of those things, out of a suite of indicators, is lesson observations. So the other things we're looking at is work scrutiny. We're talking to pupils, and we're trying to gauge and gather an understanding of the extent to which they're engaged in their learning, and the pupils' impressions of the typicality of the teaching that we're seeing. And the key to the lesson lesson observations that we're going to do is to evaluate the quality of teaching and its contribution to learning. So we're looking for evidence of progress, and the key thing is that it's over time. So none of this nonsense about expecting to see progress every 10 minutes. Heaven knows where that came from. It's over time, and that's generally over a key stage. And so evidence of progress and gains and growth in knowledge. And we're looking to see whether there are high expectations, whether there's appropriate support and challenge, what the indicators for behaviour for learning might be, and whether individual strategies are there to meet individual needs. We're also looking to see, for instance, the extent to which literacy across the curriculum is being embedded or just tacked on. And crucially too, where appropriate, spiritual, moral, social and cultural evidence as well. Now there's no way you're going to see all of that in a 20-25 minute lesson observation, so we don't expect to. Okay. Now one of the key things we're doing when we go into schools is to check how robust and secure a school's own self-evaluation is. There technically shouldn't be any surprises. And I tell you where there are surprises, it's where the schools and by and large senior leadership teams have aggregated a number of lesson observation judgments and said, well, that's the quality of our teaching. And it's not been triangulated with the wider things that I've just described, including progress over time and students' achievement. I was talking to my brother at the weekend, who's a science teacher, and the school had been in graded 3 at the last inspection, new head in, and he said, oh, well, the new head is saying that all lesson is now good or better. And I went and unpicked the data that was available to me and available to the public, and he's not actually right to say that, because the progress for the pupil premium groups is actually low. So you've got to have this link between making sure that what we're seeing is actually triangulated with wider evidence, including the progress. So my question is could the above of what I've just described be done as a paper exercise? Could it just be done as a data exercise, in which case we'd never need to leave our desks? And what I would argue is that data is queen, and that it only becomes sufficiently, I don't want to put a hierarchy and make a sexist comment about this, but if we're going to get it to be a king, it does have to have a wide range of further indicators behind it, and that's what creates the story. So the data needs a story behind it. I'll give you a very quick example. one of the aspects of my work is that I analyse GCSE results for a local authority. I know that the top performing departments generally fall into two categories. There are those where the students have achieved the top grades, VA is looking terrific, and those students will have had the fear of God put into them. I'm looking at them from an RE point of view. They're very keen to get the top grades. They will have been prepared very well for the exam. Nothing wrong with any of those. But then there'll be other schools with identical data where the experience is going to be much richer, much more complex, much more meaty and sustaining. Now, where would I want my own children to be? I mean, they're older now. I'd want them to be in that latter category where they're getting those results out of a much messier and more inclusive and debatable process. And that's really part of what we're going to look at. It's not just the final results, it's actually what's the quality of experience en route. The third point I want to make is what would need to be in place of lesson observations. I mean, they are there in the handbook, and the handbook is sitting there as a result of the law. And so if I were to go into a school and find that there had been a really sophisticated, nuanced methodology for gathering the quality of evidence for the quality of teaching, which was beyond the cheap tricks that are used in a number of schools, not all. A lot of schools are doing this really well. Along the lines of what David had just suggested, it's several things are going to follow from that. One is the quality of practice is likely to be good or better, and we're going to be invited in. Okay, and so it's possible to, I think, be much more sophisticated and nuanced and clever about this process within schools rather than terrorizing colleagues. I don't want to be made to feel a muppet. I'm very happy to be challenged, and anyone that I'm working with shouldn't be made to feel a muppet, whether it's a student or another colleague, but they should be in a context which has got high challenge and low threat. And the best schools are managing to create that, where the high stakesness of lesson observations have been taken away. There are lots of people thinking about this and working this. I'm just going to give a few headlines because of time. I mean, Dave has just given an extremely good example, the work that's being done through the N10 organisation. There's Matt O'Leary, who is doing a lot of work primarily for the FE sector, but it's got implications for us as well. And the bottom line is he says it should be based on a collegiate inquiry. My take of Hattie might not be as nuanced as it might be, is that saying we ought to get out more. Chris Moyes and others, there are others both on Twitter and here who are looking at a much more formative, discursive way of looking at improving practice. We don't need to be bad to get better. And my own view on it is that we need to be inoculating ourselves, both through being videoed. I think the power of video is going to be the next big thing on this agenda, alongside the student perceptions, which I think is probably one of the most interesting things to have come out from this evening. Not to be feared when it's properly constructed. We need to remember that, well, what we need to remember, I'm going to say, that it's one of my research interests, and that actually my conclusions from that is that we're in the black in the bank balance of goodwill from students, including the roughy-tufty and disaffected ones. They actually want more. There's more goodwill towards us than anything to be feared. So my concern about this is, are we talking to ourselves? I don't have the ear of Michael Wilshaw. Maybe someone in this room or on Twitter sphere does. I think that there are at least a couple of drivers to open this conversation out. I think the work that the Heads Round Table are doing. Is anyone here from the Heads Round Table? No, I think they were due to Tom, Sherrington and Co. I think the work that the Policy Exchange is doing. But I think that it's up to us as teachers. I count myself as a teacher. I always have a teaching project on the go. I might be an inspector, but I'm still in the classroom. Is that we've got to take ownership of this agenda. And my final point is that we need to make a case which is compelling, which is coherent, and which is collegiate, and to remember that the main thing, learning, is the main thing, and that, frankly, everything else is a footnote. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last, by no means least, Dame Alison Peacock.
Thank you very much. Perhaps with this New Year honour, I can come clean. I'm a head teacher of a primary school and I don't do lesson observations. I've been a head teacher for 11 years. And when I first went to my school, it was a school in special measures. And what I would like to present is an alternative improvement agenda. The alternative improvement agenda is about an ongoing dialogue, which is about quality of learning, not just for the children, but also for the adults and for the whole community. If you can create an environment where anything feels like it's possible, then actually amazing things start to happen. And that's not about fine grading and levelling and judging and ranking. In my opinion, that is about having high quality conversations, often at the end of the day, often kind of, sitting on the desk, talking to each other about, how did Daniel get on today? And was he able to concentrate in the way that we thought about, or what happened, and what could we do differently? And that whole kind of professional dialogue that goes on. When we started engaging in lesson study, which we started about a year, 18 months ago, we found that actually formalised something that we've been doing informally for quite some time. And I really would advocate that kind of methodology that David was describing as a means of formalising the process of really focusing on the needs of the children. But crucially, the reason our school improved so dramatically and has continued to improve, and we're now a teaching school and we work with over 60 schools as part of our alliance, the reason that's happened, I think, is because we've created a culture of trust, where anything feels like it can happen, and it's about asking really deep questions. Now, when I was listening to Rob, and he finished by talking about, young people and young people's evaluation of what goes on in classrooms and how reliable that is, to me that's no surprise, because if you had children here this evening from many primary schools up and down the country, they would be able to give you an incredibly coherent picture of their priorities for learning, that what works well in the classroom, times when they really have to think hard, times when they've gone home and they've wanted to carry on asking questions, times when they couldn't wait to come into school the next day because they were busy thinking about what they'd started thinking about yesterday. Those conversations are the ones that we miss a trick if we don't engage in. And I think the most important approach to school improvement has to be about how we create that culture with the adults and the children, where we talk and we ask and we question and we think, and it is messy and there aren't easy answers and you haven't got it all written down on a planning sheet. But the key thing is that kind of intangible sense of optimism and inquiry and energy and the desire to investigate that comes when a community works together to try to improve. And that's a lifelong process. So I think it's been incredibly refreshing to hear Rob say, perhaps we should have another way of looking at school improvement. I've been saying it for years, but only in a quiet little way as a one form-entry primary head. Now perhaps we can blast it out. So Dame Alison Peacock says, I don't do lesson observations, and I really think we should have a massive debate across the profession about how we engage children, learners, in the way that we've described. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate all the speakers today. Rob, thank you very much for starting us off. Thank you very much, David and Mary and Alison. I think, thank you very much. I think there's all sorts of food for thought. I mean, I think it is interesting that when Robert initially put his comments out there, I mean, it was sort of greeted by tosh and nonsense from a certain quarter, which is a shame, because I think there's all sorts of interesting things. And one of the things I've noticed, actually, Jonathan from Policy Exchange said it's been a little bit like sitting in an evangelical church at times, as people have been sort of nodding and going, oh yeah, as people have been talking about these things. And it really chimes, personally, with my experience as a teacher, like what actually feels developmental. And just a small anecdote. one of the processes we go through with schools in our network is we do a little audit and we talk to all sorts of teachers. And in one quite well-known school that I shan't name, we spoke to someone and said, so to what extent do you try new things out in your lessons? To what extent do you take risks and innovate? And he thought for a minute and said, no, we don't do that at all. Not at all. And I said, you don't do it at all? No. I mean, we've got these drop-in lesson observations, and they're supposed to reduce the stress for us, so we don't prepare. Basically, you don't take risks, because of course, if you're a 4, you go straight onto capability. And I just thought, is that not outstandingly damning that that is going on in one school and therefore many schools, that teachers are not taking risks, they're not being creative because of this culture where one mistake from what you're being observed, which is apparently not reliable, causes you to stop being creative, stop innovating. And I think that is just shocking. So if nothing else happens from today, I hope that we sow the seed of the end of that sort of approach to school leadership. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who's been watching on the live stream. Thank you very much, Leon, for making this possible to live stream. This is an event where we've actually had significantly more people watching online than we have in the room, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So thank you to everybody who's been watching as well. Please do keep the discussion going. #LessNobs. But let's keep this going. And I think, you know, there are some quite influential people in the room today. So I think the voices may well be heard. And I hope this is something that gains momentum. Thank you very much, Sam, for hosting us here at Teach First. Well, absolutely fantastic. I mean, it was a mark of how interesting these talks were, that no one was turning around and looking at the view, which is quite spectacular. So look forward to speaking to you more. For the people here, let's have a little mingle and have a chat. Let's not go away before everyone's had a little chat to each other and be one of those things where, like, oh, I didn't meet you, I'm sorry. We can do some questions, actually. Are we allowed, Sam? Okay, all right. So we'll do a few questions then to finish off. And it would be great if someone could have a look on Twitter and see if there are some questions from there as well. I'm actually just going to pass the microphone, and then you can say your question, and then we'll pass them to the relevant person.
It's an observation more than a question, really, about the idea of, I think somebody mentioned campaign. Yay, let's have one. Two things about that. I wear lots of hats. I'll wear my school governor hat. I think there's something really important about enabling governors to understand this. If you're a governor and I have a teaching background, most governors don't, the notion of a really simple 1, 2, 3, 4 lesson judgments, we know who's good, who's not, I think it makes governors feel very safe, that type of system. So we need to take governors with us in understanding what it would mean to get rid of that and have a different approach. And in a similar vein, particularly if lots of people in the room are on Twitter, I think we all know that the way that important, nuanced debates get kind of ruined, not just because of the 140 characters thing, but because we allow people to see us off at the pass. And I think one of the things that we need to get right in talking about this is being really clear about this isn't about rejecting accountability. This is about the evidence about what delivers school improvement and improvement in learning outcomes. And those two things are different, and obviously they connect, particularly around observation. But I know people will see us off at the pass on that one if we're not careful.
I just wanted to pick up something you said and Dame Alice said, and sort of quote a heroine of mine. This is Vera John Steiner, who's written about creative collaboration. And, you know, she talks about, you know, you being so much more powerful when you're working with somebody than you could ever possibly be on your own, however good you are on your own, and that it requires trust. And it's a very emotional business, which I think was your point. And we have to, I think, grasp that. And what you said about your school seemed to me that it was actually a very trusting environment in which people could collaborate and be creative. And yeah, and I think that's one of the main functions of senior leadership, to achieve that environment. Because if you don't achieve that, you don't get any risk taking, and you know, it's a pretty dull place to be, and the learning is not very clever.
Absolutely, thank you. It's also worth saying the research is very clear. Student outcomes improve more with collaborative professional learning than individual professional learning. Research is clear on that. So, more questions, yes.
Yeah, question for Mary Myatt. You arrive at a school and you ask, so, you know, tell me about the quality of teaching in your school. And the head teacher says, I have not given one teacher a lesson grade for X number of years. It's all, as just described by Dame Alison. What happens then? What if you were to go out? Evidence is great, data's great, but you go out and see a bunch of lessons which your team are grading as requires improvement. What happens next?
That's a great question. I don't actually. That hasn't happened to me, and B, I think it would be very unlikely that it would follow. If you've got that kind of high quality professional, it's basically high quality grounded assessment for learning for grown-ups, which are ongoing conversations about learning. It's very unlikely that would happen. We would still need to go and check though, because we're just looking to see is what the school's saying. Is it actually, insofar as we are human beings and we make mistakes, are we seeing a similar picture to what the school is saying? That's one of the reasons why we do joint lesson observations, that the picture is generally similar.
But if the people you're jointly observing with them have done
Thank you.
So we've had 3 outstanding inspections, and each time we've had a team in, we've had all the tracking data there. Obviously, you have to have all that there. But in terms of a file of lesson observations, the most recent Ofsted that we had was in May of last year, and we had a file that included lots of lesson study conversations, and they weren't graded. None of the observations were graded. The only ones that were graded were where we'd got trainee teachers with us, and obviously they need to have a grade because they're working with the university and so on. And very quickly, the team who came in could, we did do some joint observations, but they could see very quickly the quality of the learning experience that was going on. And crucially, the children themselves were incredibly articulate about what they were learning now and what they were learning next and why they were doing it. And that it was that articulacy from the children, as well as seeing, the lesson as you would expect to see it. And I completely take the point from Rob Coe. They probably were all the proxies that we tend to see in place, in terms of what stands for a good lesson. I'm sure they were all there, but it's also backed up by that inquiry that is much more deep-rooted. So both those together, plus the data, enable the judgment.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Thanks, David. This might be for Rob as well, but I mean, having worked with lesson study for about 12 years, I don't think that it would be very likely that we would ever get to a stage where you would get very consistent observations about children's learning in a classroom, because classrooms are so complex. I mean, Rob, you said it's invisible. We're hypothesizing about what might happen in a lesson. There are 30 different things that are all going in very different ways. What I think you do get through that kind of close observation of children's learning is a better understanding about glimpses of that learning taking place, which enables you to respond more effectively next time. And it's happening again in my latest piece of work. The thing that happens again and again, 9 times out of 10, is that you will pick your 3 case pupils, and by the end of that first research lesson, you'll discover that the assessment that you've had of that pupil for years, as a school, as an individual, was completely wrong. And that just happens so regularly. That's a third of all our knowledge of pupils over many, many, many studies is very unreliable. So I don't think we'll ever get reliable, but I do think we'll get better at understanding what to do to help children learn.
Thank you, Pete. Any other questions? Do we have any questions from Twitter? Anyone who's monitoring it? Someone who's monitoring the Twitter hashtag? Yeah, could you?
So, question from Mike Bostock. Does it matter that there's a huge variation in how well schools make use of performance data?
Interesting one. I don't know who we're going to make that. David, how would you like to answer that one?
Does it matter? Yes. Yes, it does matter.
Okay, no.
Yeah. Yes, it does. And again, making the point that it's not the king, it's the queen. But the real concern is when you've got pockets of groups of children who are not necessarily making the same progress as either the rest of the cohort or against national measures. And it's a real concern, actually. Every now and then, it's not often, you go into a school which is a data desert, and they have not got the information that they need to be able to move youngsters on. One of the things we look at before we go in and do an inspection and that a lead would analyse are the rates of progress, which we've got information on for English and maths. And it always raises questions for me if the children coming in, say at level 5, are not making expected levels of progress. Saying something about the quality of experience there, which we're going to want to ask some questions about. So the data is really important, but it has to be used with a light touch. It mustn't be, it mustn't define an individual. I never want to hear a child saying, I'm a level 4. No, you're not. You're a human being. And similarly, oh, I'm only good. Your aspects of your lesson were good. So this translation of the data to the human being is absolutely criminal and absolutely needs to stop. So yeah, it's about being really commonsensical about it and using it to drive sensible movement forward.
I'd probably add to that as well. I think you see in schools, again, top-down and bottom-up uses of data. So I think, for example, we often see where teachers, I just have to type something in, and then the senior leaders then do all the analysis for that and hand down a judgment and then say, I have seen this, you are not doing well enough. Whereas I think when you see the schools who are using it well, the teachers themselves are gathering an interpretation of that data, passing it up through to senior leaders through conversation and discussion, and they talk together about how they can improve it. And those teachers are using it in a very granular way about small bits of learning to really understand the small pieces of learning and how they can help move that forward. And I think that's really different from what progress have you made against your FFT targets, or how many have you made your 2 levels of progress. Really, really different, and I think you see 2 different things there. Rob, did you want to say something on that?
Add another comment to that. Both those questions, actually. So yes, I think it matters almost more than anything how people use data, what they understand about assessment, because assessment varies a lot in its quality and the kinds of inferences that can be supported by it. How's that assessment being done, and so on. And there's massive room for improvement there in very many schools, I think. And just to comment on Pete's observation there that different observers may not agree, well, that may not matter at all. It depends what you want to use the observation for. And the lesson study context is one where different insights all contribute. So that's fine. If you don't want to use lesson observation for grading, then it may not matter at all that different people see different things. But if you do want to use it for grading, then it matters a lot. Yeah, it's a strength. Yeah.
Okay, do we have some more questions from let's go over here, then another one on Twitter. So yes.
As a school governor with responsibility for, I hate to say it, pay and appraisal policies, how confident can I be in the assessments of teachers?
Yeah, Rob, that sounds like one for you.
Yeah, well, you are. Yeah, absolutely. You should be worried, I think. Well, I think it comes back to that question about interpretation of data. People should be. Data is an important part of making those judgments, if that judgments have to be made. But that requires that people are able to cope with that, that they take the view, for example, that if I have 2 bits of information that don't agree, I'm better off than if I just had 1. Now, most people don't think that. They like to have just 1 because it's simpler. But actually, they're wrong. They're better off with 2, even though they don't agree. So, and that's partly about the sophistication of understanding and use of data. So there is a problem there, but it comes down ultimately to judgment. Judgment should be informed by data, but judgment shouldn't be made by data.
Unfortunately, again, as a governor, I'm not actually making the judgment. I have to rely on someone else's judgment.
Okay, so you don't make the judgment yourself. So there needs to be a process, and there needs to be the capabilities for people involved to make that judgment well, I think.
I think part of the problem is that it's all data. Everything we make a judgment on is data of one kind or another, and that learning is always invisible, but a much better proxy of learning might be an exam rather than what happens in a classroom. So I'd rather go with that data rather than make it, base it on anything that I see and are fooled into thinking is good when actually what I'm probably wrong.
Yeah,
so
it's I'm thinking very recently we were told that 100% of teaching in my school is good or better. How confident?
No, but that's a nonsense. But I mean, I think that that what happens that the thing that's the problem is where these judgments are actually used to contradict the data. So you've got the crusty old bugger who's been teaching for 30 years and does everything that they're not supposed to according to sort of trendy ideas about what we should be doing. They get great results, and yet people go in and judge them as requiring improvement, try and change them. And that's where it's shocking.
It's worth just saying, recently went up to Cramlington Learning Village, who have, again, an amazing reputation for professional learning. And interestingly, the deputy head there said that in their last Ofsted, when talking about the quality of CPD, he brought huge folders of, like, here's all the peer observation we've been doing, here's the practitioner research, the master's level, and so on. The Ofsted inspector actually said to him, I don't want to know that. Give me a couple of bits of paper. I want to know the grades your teachers are on now, the actions you're planning to deal with them, and then how you're monitoring how those grades are improving. That's all I want to see. So I'm just reflecting that, and that might be different inspectors. I mean, they still got outstanding, but I'm just saying, people, that is happening, and that's for a school who, again, they're not into their graded lesson observations, but for them it's like, oh, okay, well maybe we have to do that. So you are working against that background. Can we just take? There was another question from Twitter, was there?
I wanted to know how many teachers were in your school, Alison, and what the turnover was.
There was, and I guess what's behind that question is, did I sack everybody at the beginning when the school was in special measures? And the reality is there was one teacher who, after 9 months of trying to work with her, it was quite clear she didn't like children. And for me, that is a fundamental flaw in a relationship with the class, and she left. Encouraged to leave by me, but the rest of the staff stayed, and some of them subsequently went on to take on advisory roles. So it wasn't that everybody left and we just started afresh. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, right. Sorry, we had some more questions over here. Loic.
So we've talked about those kind of extreme cases of schools where one bad observation and you're on capability or whatever, and we've talked about the Dame Alison's model of something really solid and interesting and so on. But isn't there also a kind of middle ground, which is that actually a lot of the time when a school decides from observation that a teacher's underperforming and so on, it's actually not one of those cases of just one observation or whatever. It's actually about multiple observers and some consistency. So it tends to be when in some relatively decent schools, you have got several people coming in observing, external people coming in observing, and action starts to be taken once there's a consistent judgment. Can you say something, probably, Robert, about what you think of those kind of cases?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the challenge is to differentiate between the kind of flaky one-off judgments that wouldn't be replicated and the judgments that are likely to be sounder because they come from multiple sources, because they come from better sources. They're better judgments. So it comes down to understanding the quality of different evidence and using that effectively to make good judgments. That's all there is to it, if you like, and yet that's the hardest thing in the world. So yeah, I agree. I don't think I'm not against observation. I hope nobody's hearing me saying that. I think we should do observation. I just think we should do it better. I'm in favour of data. I'm in favour of assessment. I'm in favour of collecting student ratings and parent ratings and peer ratings and all the kinds of ratings we can, and then using judgment to come up with interpretations of all that different stuff. But that's a really, really hard thing to do.
Any more questions? Otherwise, we'll just take probably one or two more questions if we have any, or from Twitter. Has anyone else spotted any other questions, or have we tired out the Twitter sphere? Okay. Appear to tired out everybody. Okay. Well, so listen, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you again to Sam for hosting, to all the speakers. Thank you to the audience. Please do mingle and have a chat, and keep tweeting Lesson Obs, and let's see where we go from here. Thank you.